Hello and welcome to the Spectator's local election show. I'm James Heale, and for the next hour, we're going to be going through everything that happened last night. Votes are still being counted, but there is only one clear winner, Nigel Farage. His party has triumphed in Runcorn and Helsby. We'll be speaking to our political correspondent Lucy Dunn, who is on the scene, alongside a whole host of guests and Spectator regulars to make sense of exactly what's just happened. Most importantly of all, you can let us know what you think live in the comments in the chat. So on this side of this video, make sure to share your thoughts, comments and questions along the way. But now, it's time for this. Welcome to Coffee House Shots, the Spectator's daily politics podcast. I'm delighted to be joined by Tim Shipman, our incoming political editor, and Isabel Hartman, the Spectator's assistant editor. Thank you both for joining me here today. Tim, let's put these elections in some context. Reform doing very well, but how significant are they going to be?
I think we overuse the word unprecedented, and I think we overuse the word historic when we're writing about British politics. And there's been a lot of crazy, big stuff happening, huge change over the last 10 years. But I think these are potentially the most significant local elections of my adult lifetime. And I think the future of British politics and what happens up to the next general election is being framed in front of our very eyes now. You look at Reform achieving breakthroughs that UKIP or the Brexit Party never managed. They are taking votes from both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, and that's the sort of the big picture issue. The two main parties are no longer totally dominant in British politics. You've got a new kid on the block that not only is a receptacle rather for protest votes, but he's actually taking councils. They've already got two mayoralties, they've got three councils, and the challenge for Nigel Farage is not just to say you hate these big parties, they've let you down for decades. He now needs to be able to say in a couple of years' time, we actually fixed stuff, we did stuff, and look at Lincolnshire, look at Staffordshire, look where we've been running the show. We've filled in your potholes, we've dealt with the local issues that annoy you, and now you need to give us a chance on the national stage. And if they can pull that off, then this could be very significant indeed.
Isabel, we're going to come on to the Conservatives in a second, but first of all, Labour. What a night of drama it was. We had the Runcorn by-election, just 4 votes in it. I think that is the closest by-election we've had since the Great War. What does it mean for Labour? Because yes, they held on narrowly in some places, like the North East mayoralty, but overall it's been a pretty dire night for them, isn't it?
Yeah, it's been really difficult. I should apologise outright that I thought the sensible thing to do during this podcast was to lock my dogs in the garden, and they're now crying through the cat flap. So we have a sort of tragic backdrop to everything I'm saying, rather like Labour at one of the counts that's gone on overnight. So I apologise for that. I thought it was really interesting hearing Keir Starmer's response to this morning, which was basically to say, I could stand here and say that, we've achieved this, that and the other, which he then obviously was saying. But actually, I get it, which is also another typical politician thing to do. He was sort of framing it as I'm the unconventional politician who says different things. He then went on to list all the things that Labour is achieving, but said, but I understand that people want us to go further and faster with the change that they voted for. But what's really fascinating about that is that the message that a lot of Labour MPs have taken from the overnight results is that what the party is ploughing ahead with, particularly cuts to the winter fuel payment, is really unpopular with voters. And so for a lot of them hearing those words, we need to go faster, they're thinking, no, you need to slow down and do something completely different, go off in a different direction. We don't like where you're taking the party at the moment. So I think Starmer tried to have an unconventional response to particularly the Runcorn result, and ended up sounding, I think, like every party leader that any of us have listened to over the past sort of 2 decades responding to a bad by-election result.
I mean, the boilerplate response is always to say, this proves what I've always said, and we must do more of what I always said. And that's exactly what Starmer's doing. Those of you that are on social media, have a quick look at what Luke Trill of More in Common has been putting out. He's done a very interesting graph of issues that people noticed and issues that people had a positive or negative opinion of. The issue that is by far the most noticed by voters and the least popular is the winter fuel stuff, and that is really hurting Labour. And I've been talking to Labour people over the last few months who say, should we reverse it? Is it too late? And most of the sort of clever polly people, they will say, well, actually, it's never too late to reverse a mistake, and it's clearly causing them trouble. And if I was Labour, I'd be worried in those kind of northwestern seats where they've held the councils, but Reform has come into second place. And I think reform's probably a little bit closer than either Morgan McSweeney or people like us thought they were going to be. But actually, the interesting thing is that in some of those areas, the Tory vote did not collapse. It held up okay. And if those voters next time think, we'll vote tactically reform, then Labour could lose a whole swathe of seats in those areas at the next general election.
Well, I mean, we are in the era of five-party politics, as Sir John Curtis told us last week. But overall, I mean, Tim, this is a pretty bad night for the Conservatives, isn't it? I don't think even most Tories who were bracing themselves for lots of losses would have expected it to be this bad.
No, I think that's right. And I think, look, in a sense, pricing it all in, as we have done for weeks and weeks, that they're going to lose X hundreds of seats, they're going to lose a whole bunch of councils. Possible that the Tories lose control of almost all the councils they were in control of overnight. The Lib Dems were kind of predicting that in one of their briefings last week. But I think the scale of it is bigger than we thought. And because people had sort of priced in that it's really bad, and the assumption is, no one will come for Kemi Badenoch yet, they'll wait a year till after the Welsh elections. The sheer shock of this actually means that when I sort of woke up this morning and started looking at my messages, my inbox is inundated with Conservatives saying, this isn't working, she needs to go, why should we wait a year? Why should we faff about for another year, giving Farage 12 months in which to gather more momentum? If we're going to do this now. And I got one message from someone saying, look, there's this assumption that if we change leader again, it's we'll be seen as a basket case. But changing a leader of the opposition is very different from changing a sitting Prime Minister, which the Conservative Party did relentlessly in the last Parliament. And I think there are people that are slightly more up for that than I think even they were expecting 12 hours ago. And that, to me, is one of the interesting things that happened.
And I think one of the really striking things, of course, is that it's Robert Jenrick who's been doing the media round rather than Kemi Badenoch today. And I think that's been noticed by some people who've messaged me, members, etc., who said, I voted for Kemi, but, it's Rob out there. And it's really much the Rob show, isn't it, Isabel?
Yeah, Robert Jenrick walking along, speaking into the camera, moving faster in many of his videos, I feel, than he did in the actual marathon. And I think we're going to see a lot more of these kind of Robert Jenrick campaign videos on social media. But yeah, fascinating that he's also the Conservative voice sort of mopping up from these election results. And just back to Tim's point about Conservatives saying, well, actually, wouldn't it be better to remove the leader now rather than, in a couple of years' time when voters are paying more serious attention to us? I suppose there's also the argument of, if they removed another leader, it wouldn't be a surprising new piece of information about the Conservative Party that they quite like removing leaders. So they might as well get on with it now and have the right leader, as opposed to continuing in the space where they are. And I think that's the skill of Nigel Farage, actually, in his response to Reform's stunning set of results, is that he immediately said, Kemi, please stay, we want more of you. So he immediately starts punching what is already a very sore spot for the Conservative Party about their leader, focusing it in on the thing that is guaranteed to send Conservatives bananas, because they love nothing more than talking about whether they should replace their leader, even when a leader is doing well.
And this Jenrick gambit is very interesting. I bet he volunteered for it because he wants to go out and be performatively loyal, but he also wants to go out and say, look at me, I'm the one taking the pain on a day like this. I'm acting as the leader's human shield. She would probably have wanted him to do it because she wants him to be bought in and to be forced to say, she's doing well, let's all stick together. But, politics operates on many levels, and I think we can all see the different levels that Mr. Jenrick is doing by heroically going out to defend his party today. It's all about the subtext, and I don't think any of us doubts that he thinks there ought to be a change of leader sooner rather than later.
I mean, we're expecting lots more of these kind of results. Of course, the main story overnight, Tim, has been about sort of reform, but of course it's going to later be about the Liberal Democrats.
Absolutely. Some
of those kind of so-called blue wall areas where they went big in 2021.
That's right. And, the Libs were at pain to stress this to journalists last week. The whole story for the first sort of up to probably quite late afternoon is going to be about reform. But please don't forget about us, because a lot of the places where they're going to be strong, Oxfordshire, Cambridgeshire, Buckinghamshire, some of the parts of the West Country, they're quite slow to count down in Devon, and they're hoping to make big advances there. And I think what it will show, I think, there's some concern, I think, in both parties about this. I think the truth of it is that the Lib Dems are taking some votes from the Labour Party, but they will be taking a lot of seats from the Conservative Party. So it's a plague slightly on both their houses. And, there is a question about whether Starmer and McSweeney have got it right in terms of where they're positioning this government. They've fought so hard on sort of immigration and on welfare to try and cauterise the route, the leaching of votes to reform, that they've left their left flank pretty exposed. And in parts of the Bristol mayoralty and all of that, the Greens will be very strong. And in a lot of these blue wall Tory areas, the once true blue shires, the Libs are probably going to make more advances. And their strategy is very much from the period of Paddy Ashdown. Dave McCobb, who's their campaign director, is a very shrewd guy. He's a former sort of ground campaign chief. And he knows if you get councillors, you've then got foot soldiers, and you can hold the terrain you've got. There were 312 Tory seats, I think, where the Libs either already hold the parliamentary constituency or have some realistic hope of taking it next time. And I think what we'll see late afternoon and into the early evening is them putting quite a lot of tanks on the Tory lawns in those places.
Isabel, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree that the Lib Dems have not been the story of the night, and they weren't expecting to be that. But their results should worry the Conservatives as much as reform, and actually the dual challenge of reform and the Lib Dems is the worrying thing for the Conservatives, because if you appear to be moving too close to I suppose a reform more right-wing agenda, I think is fair to say, even though reform are not right-wing on everything, particularly when it comes to, say, the welfare state. But if you do appear to be moving more in that direction, then you lose your kind of home counties, internationalist, quite upset about Trump, like to listen to the rest is politics, other podcasts are available, type people. And so it's difficult because you are basically, and this is always the case in British politics, but more so now the electorate is so volatile. If you please one group, you're going to annoy another group, and the party is very vulnerable with both at the moment.
And I think, but doesn't that emphasise the need for good leadership? Because good leadership doesn't necessarily mean positioning yourself here or there. It means telling a story, whatever it is, effectively to the country, and being highly professional at the way you conduct yourself and how you sort of get out there and get your message across. And so, in a sense, the Conservatives are probably about to have another of their periodic rows about how right-wing they ought to be. But actually what they need to be doing is who is a good performer, who is someone with conviction, but also a sense of how to appeal to people. And, various conclusions will be drawn about that.
Yeah, and, it's not just, if we come back to the Robert Jenrick question, it's not just actually about the weakness of Kemi Badenoch and the relative strength, energy, whatever of Robert Jenrick. It's also about the wider party and the front bench in particular, who are, they're largely invisible, aren't they? I mean, they are so low wattage that they appear to be part of Ed Miliband's energy policy. And it just sort of, and you wonder whether that's because some of them are reasonably new to such high-profile briefs, whether they don't particularly want to throw their lot in with Kemi Badenoch, whether they're in some sort of stage of political grief where they've all mentally checked out. I mean, I think the latter is probably the explanation for why we haven't seen complete chaos in the Conservative Party since last summer's election, which many of us, myself included, were expecting. I thought that actually they would make the turmoil before the election look relatively sedate once they'd lost and they were out of government. But I think, and Badenoch was celebrating that this week, saying that one of the surprises that she's had is how united everyone's been. I'm not sure it's united over something. I think it's either sort of, on their own kind of planet, or not having anything to react against because she's not setting out any policy or indeed doing much repudiation of the Conservative governments that came before. And so if you're not taking a position on anything, then people can just sort of trundle on in quite a boring fashion for quite a long time.
I mean, Pat McFadden, the Cabinet Office Labour Minister, has a great phrase for this when he refers to his own party. He talks about the unity of the graveyard, and there's an element of that about this. Some of them have checked out completely, some of them have gone to the beach. But when you're looking for someone to come and make an impact, I think Robert Jenrick is very much the best placed to step in if there is a vacancy. But you will start to hear one other word being raised. Someone who's done some focus groups this week said to me this morning, the answer is the blonde, and we all know what that means. Mr. Boris Johnson, who has spent most of last year earning $300,000 per speech, and going on holiday for a fortnight wherever he made that speech, and has barely troubled the scorers, is likely to rear his head. And he'll certainly be writing his Daily Mail column about all of this evening. We'll see how loyal he is, or how many little droplets about the ball at the back of the scrum manage to find their way into print.
Well, we look forward to reading that, and also you in print at the Spectator, Tim. When do you start that with us?
I am starting mid-June, so I think my first appearance in the magazine will be the week of the 18th of June.
Well, we look forward to that. Thank you,
much
Tim.
Looking forward to it too.
And thank you as well, and thank you for watching Coffee House Shots live today. We'll be right back after this, and afterwards we'll be going to Runcorn with Lucy Dunn, and we'll hear from John McTernan and Gwen Towler. If you've got questions for either of them, leave them in the comments below, and we'll be sure to ask them to both of them.
If you enjoy Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? You can get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer. This is the cover of the magazine this week. Ross Clark writes about Britain's most radical lawyers. Freddie Gray assesses whether Trump's big gambles are paying off. And Philip Patrick interviews Japan's last ninja. Subscribe today to read all of this, and so much more.
Not everyone in this room is going to enjoy this next bit, which excites me enormously.
It's a very unique opportunity. I listen to Coffee House Shots podcast like every single day. I love Kate Andrews.
Gentleman in the front row whose shoes and tie are far too nice to allow him to qualify as a working person under Keir Starmer's definition.
I think there's something engaging with listening to people you vehemently disagree with.
Do you think you're going to be able to win hearts and minds from the audience?
No, of course not, but it's going to be a great evening.
Nationalism versus globalisation.
I think the government doesn't have any kind of plan.
Do you feel like you might want to come to more Spectator events in the future?
Yeah, for sure.
The next Spectator Coffee House Shots Live will be a fascinating dissection of the local election results. The first big electoral test for all of the parties since the general election last year. How will Labour fare less than 1 year in? What will the future be for the Tories? And can Reform's surge be sustained? We'll be talking to two of the key influencers in this debate, Jacob Rees-Mogg from the Conservatives and Zia Youssef of Reform. Come along to the Emmanuel Centre, hear from them direct, and also enter a prize draw to come and have champagne afterwards here at the Spectator's offices, either to toast your success or to drown your sorrow.
Welcome back to the Spectator's local election live show. I'm joined now by Reform insider Gwen Towler. Now, Gwen, what do you make of these results?
They're extraordinary. They are extraordinary. Nothing like this has happened in British politics in living memory. I don't know if it's happened in British politics, period, not in the democratic period. Right now, we have 8 county councils we control from a standing start. I think last year, how many candidates did we stand? We stood about 5% of candidates.
Something like that, yeah.
It was a minimal number. And yet, this year, we now control 8 county councils, and I believe there may be 1 or 2 others that are in the mix.
In the last hour, just before coming on air, you said that, is it Kent?
Kent, we've just
Reform
taken Kent.
Wow.
Nottinghamshire.
Yep.
West Nottinghamshire, Lancashire, Staffordshire, Lincolnshire, Durham. And these are not. It's not just against the Tories, is it?
No.
Taking Labour seats as well as Tory seats. We're taking Lib Dem seats in Leicestershire. This is an all points, all purpose. What I'm calling the teal tide.
The teal tide. Well, I went even more boosterish this morning. I did my article, 4 a.m, woke up, did the teal tsunami.
Well, I think tsunami is the teal and tsunami. You could have turquoise tsunami. That's a long enough word.
I need a good spin doctor.
There you are, a word crafter. No, it is an extraordinary night.
Yeah.
And the Tories did, in the end, win in Cambridgeshire, in the mayoralty. I think the Labour bloc must be really annoyed. Not. Because then they came fourth, didn't they?
Yeah.
They held it.
Yeah.
That's astonishing. But we pushed the Tories in Cambridgeshire to the edge. The Cambridge itself saved them. That's amazing. And if you look at the mayoralties, you have one we won.
Yeah.
One that the Tories won.
Cambridgeshire.
But the other four,
yeah,
we came second. We beat the Tories in all the mayoralties other than the one they won, and we ran them close. It is not surprising to me that the Labour Party has spent all their efforts attacking us and haven't mentioned the Tories in their campaign.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm told that Pat McFadden in a recent SPAD school actually said our big threat the next election is not the Tories, it's reform. So he's telling that.
I don't think the Tories could threaten. I don't know. They could have threatened some loo roll on the wall. I mean, right now, they're about as threatening as I am at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I'm asleep then.
I'm not sure you were this morning, but
no,
in terms of these locals, I mean, Reform have tried a few different things this time, right? I mean, you look at, say, the information requests to do a sort of Doge, take the sort of national issue, make it local, give those stories to local papers. You look at also how Nigel's presented himself.
We've actually given stories to local papers in the past.
No, but in such a systematic way, of course,
very much so, yeah.
At a time when, of course, the other two parties certainly are not giving many stories to local papers.
Well, I've always found, and it's something that we've always been taken very seriously, people trust local papers.
Yeah.
Far more than they trust national papers. And whenever Farage goes somewhere, the first interview is almost always with the local paper.
Yeah.
Because you know what? Fleet Street, you guys, you see him all the time. You get to talk to him whenever you want to.
Yeah.
But the Lincolnshire, the Boston Standard, only sees him when he's there.
And a national figure, having a one-to-one time.
And that is important because they are, local papers are, local media is deeply important for democracy, yes, for all sorts of things, because who watches over the councils when they're corrupt? It's not the national press, it's the local press. And these things are desperately, desperately important.
And how has Nigel presented himself in this campaign? You've made the point to me before that there's almost a slight Christian twist with sort of, he's been talking more about fisher of men's souls before.
Well, I think there is it's a passion, it's a drive, it's a mission. I loved his comment when he was asked that by Tanya Gold or something, sort of Donald Trump. Donald Trump thinks he was, after the assassination attempt, he thinks he was saved by God to save America. Mr. Farage, do you feel after your brushes with death that you've been saved by God? And he said, well, I've been saved, but it may be somebody else. It's a delightful comment. But I'd like to raise one single councillor, one that right now is my moment of the night. A guy called Julian Kirk, who looks the traditional idea of a councillor. He's a little bit stout, a little bit bald. He's an agricultural machine sales family business in Norfolk. And he was so disgusted by the Tories cancelling the elections in Norfolk that he resigned his seat, resigned the Tories, joined Reform, resigned his seat and forced a by-election so the people of Norfolk had one county council seat there where they got to vote. He got 54.9%.
Wow.
And that was something, that's an absolute brilliant result for democracy. But to have the honour and the decency to say this is wrong, the people deserve to vote me out if they so desire, and then to get such a response, 54.9%. It's a testament to, one, his character, but also people.
Yeah.
People respecting honour.
And just the final question, Gwaine. Has Nigel presented himself as a bit more of a centrist or a moderate in this campaign?
I don't think so.
He's
heard his speeches?
Yeah, I have heard his speeches. But he's talking about special education needs in Durham. It's sort of.
Well, of course, because County councils pay for them.
But it was, of course, yes, but it was a different type. It felt like a slightly different, on the trade unions point, for instance.
What I think is slightly different about this campaign compared to others, let's be honest, we've not ever really seen local government as that important because we were single-issue parties. And now we're not. Now the tribe has grown up.
Yes.
And because it's grown up, it has to deal with the reality that county councils do work.
No.
They do stuff. This isn't just high politics, not the highfalutin international constitutional stuff. This is the day-to-day bread and butter. We have to focus on that because now, in 8 counties, we actually have to deliver.
Yes.
And the fact that Nigel's been able to switch from his day-to-day bang to the this is what has to be done. Yes, it is a switch, but it is a switch that was required and necessary.
Well, we've actually just got now our reporter, Lucy Dunn, who is in Runcorn and Helsby after that fantastic night there. What a night of drama, 4 votes in it. Thank you for joining us, Wayne. Lucy, you stayed up for the count and the recount. How's Reform feeling up there?
I think the atmosphere up here is jubilant amongst the Reform camp. Quite clearly, they had a very long night, given we had a recount. There was 6 votes in it in the end, but certainly a really impressive result for Reform, given that this is coming off the back of 18% at the July general election and a Labour safe seat. I think certainly what's been fascinating is that amongst the Reform voters up here, there is that sort of real, definitely a buzz, but I think certainly there's still that kind of feeling as though like there's a lot that they want from Reform in terms of delivery. They want promises about how things are going to shape up. They want to see, in terms of even just voter trust, I think there's a real mission there for Reform to prove that not only will they work well in this area until the next general election, but that with councillors across the country too, they are presenting a number of suitable candidates that are electable in 5 years' time. And so I think that when you speak to people on the streets, as much as they're happy about the result, there's certainly a strong Reform contingency here, and certainly a strong anti-Labour contingency. There's still a lot of work, I think, for Reform to do in the next couple of years.
And Lucy, I mean, you were there, you were texting me sort of bleary-eyed at 4 a.m. How did the scenes unfold? Because there was a recount, there was sort of talk of aides sort of sprinting back and forth, checking ballots. What were your moments from the night itself?
Yeah, I think it was, understandably, everyone was very anxious on both sides. Labour and Reform knew it was going to be a close call, and ultimately it was incredibly close. I think what was fascinating was at one point we heard that Nigel Farage was about to turn up. He was apparently outside in the car park. Some reports saying he was circling the building. I'm not entirely sure if he would agree with that. But there was that kind of real ebb and flow. And I think that at these types of events, often nothing happens for hours and then suddenly everything does. But I think there was, from the Labour camp, certainly that real anxiety, and you saw that with the activists. They were much more, in many ways, terrified looking. I think one reporter described it to me in comparison to the Reform camp, who, as much as they were nervous, were sort of had that kind of quite optimistic anticipation sense around them.
And, Labour, of course, has a formidable Northwest by-election machine, famously considered one of the heartlands of the party. Presumably, if Reform can come here, just basically a year after not having much of a party machine, as Gwaine Towler was just saying there, that's a real message, isn't it, to the rest of the country, which is that maybe right now they're not ready for a national campaign in a sense of a general election, but if Reform can win here, they can win pretty much anywhere, right?
Well, absolutely. I think I'm actually now in Frodsham, and I'm actually in the pub that ex-Labour MP Mike Amesbury left at 2 a.m. before he then went and had that sort of infamous scrap with one of his constituents. And I think the message that I've had from people on the streets here ultimately is that, there's a sense of dissatisfaction with the policy positions that Labour has set out when it comes to disability, the NHS, when you look at the winter fuel payment cuts. But there's also a real sense of not trusting politicians just now. And I think that Reform are pushing that, anti-establishment type sort of, I think ultimately people want to see more of, pushing back against these sort of men in suits that sort of make all these promises before they get elected and then don't show up to their constituencies. But certainly it feels as though there is a turn of the tide, and I think there's a real excitement about what this type of election means for both the Hollywood and Senate elections next year, but also for 2029 general election.
Yeah, I mean, you obviously, Lucy, cover Holyrood a lot for The Spectator. Not to get too ahead of ourselves and talk about the next election, but I mean, presumably everyone in Scottish Labour is going to be looking at this. Recent polls suggest that they're only on course to win, I think it is 25 seats or thereabouts in Holyrood. I mean, that's an incredible fall from where they were this time last year, where they're expecting to win a Holyrood election, come top and potentially get rid of the SNP. What's the mood like in Scottish Labour at now?
Yeah, I think people are certainly very worried. There's a point at which I think last year Anna Sarwar, the Scottish Labour leader, thought he might have a shot at being First Minister. I think that is not really looking so likely now. And actually, I was speaking to a Scottish Labour activist and also some staffers earlier in the day. They were saying it's not really the Nats, the SNP, that are threatening them anymore. They're actually really now concerned about how reform has been cut into the unionist support up north of the border. And I think next year's Hollywood elections, if reform do take any seats, and they're projected to take 14 or 15 from a standing start, will really show how the mood music is changing up in Scotland too.
Well, thanks, Lucy, for telling us what the mood is like in Runcorn and for keeping us up to date on Scottish Labour as well. So that was Lucy Dunn, the Spectator's political correspondent. Keep your comments coming in. We're going to read out some of them later. But it's time for a quick break now. But afterwards, we're going to be talking to polling experts, our economics editor, Michael Simmons, and Tony Blair's former political secretary, John McTernan, as well. Stay tuned.
If you enjoy Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? You can get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer. This is the cover of the magazine this week. Ross Clark writes about Britain's most radical lawyers. Freddie Gray assesses whether Trump's big gambles are paying off. And Philip Patrick interviews Japan's last ninja. Subscribe today to read all of this, and so much more.
Not everyone in this room is going to enjoy this next bit, which excites me enormously.
It's a very unique opportunity. I listen to Coffee House Shots podcast like every single day. I love Kate Andrews.
Gentleman in the front row whose shoes and tie are far too nice to allow him to qualify as a working person under Keir Starmer's definition.
I think there's something engaging with listening to people you vehemently disagree with.
Do you think you're going to be able to win hearts and minds from the audience?
No, of course not, but it's going to be a great evening.
Nationalism versus globalisation.
I think the government doesn't have any kind of plan.
Do you feel like you might want to come to more Spectator events in the future? Yeah, for sure.
The next Spectator Coffee House Shots Live will be a fascinating dissection of the local election results. The first big electoral test for all of the parties since the general election last year. How will Labour fare less than 1 year in? What will the future be for the Tories? And can reform's surge be sustained? We'll be talking to two of the key influencers in this debate, Jacob Rees-Mogg from the Conservatives and Zia Youssef of Reform. Come along to the Emmanuel Centre, hear from them direct, and also enter a prize draw to come and have champagne afterwards here at the Spectator's offices, either to toast your success or to drown your sorrow.
Hello, welcome back. Thank you very much for sending in your comments. I'm just going to read a couple of them now. Can you talk about how a right-wing party in picking up votes in Labour areas? It seems odd that a small state Thatcherite like Farage is able to win in Durham, which hated Maggie, says one of our commenters. And another one says, isn't it striking that it takes Nigel Farage, not Westminster, to say what ordinary people are thinking and feeling? Do you think the Farage momentum has legs, or is it just a flash-in-the-pan phenomena? And finally, Lucy Dunn, how do you manage to wear that top today? I'm roasting in a summer dress. I don't think we'll address the final one, but I think the first point is a good one. I'm joined now by Chris Hopkins, Political Research Director at Savanta, and Holly Day from Ipsos. Chris, we'll start with you first of all. I mean, that is the interesting question, isn't it? Nigel Farage, I spoke to him just last month for a column saying he still thinks that Margaret Thatcher would join Reform today. How is it, in a sense, that he's able to appeal as a sort of southern ex-Tory member, if you will, to some of these red wall areas like we've just seen in Runcorn and Helsby?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what Reform UK and Nigel Farage in particular stand for is the left behind and the disenfranchised and the disillusioned. And I think that there are a lot of voters, similar to the disillusionment that they perhaps felt under Margaret Thatcher, that ultimately that resonates with them today. And I think that, as Westminster politics, particularly among the Labour Party, but among the Conservatives too, has become increasingly professionalised and perhaps increasingly southern, I guess, for want of a better word. I think that has allowed, an insurgent with the political communication skills that Nigel Farage has to be able to really capitalise on that level of disenfranchisement and disillusionment. And I think that, had there been far more council seats up in this round that were Labour defences, other than the vast swathes of them being Tory defences, I think we would probably see a very similar story across the country to what we've seen in Northumberland and Durham.
Absolutely. And Holly, looking at these polls, we've often heard about reform, as we heard there, being potentially a flash-in-the-pan phenomena. But this proved that the polls were right, that basically reform is able to win in seats broadly in line with where they're polling. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it's undeniable that they've made massive strides in this particular election. As Chris said there are particular contextual factors to do with this election in terms of the types of seats that were up for grabs. And given the polling data that we'd seen in the past kind of 3 to 4 months in the run-up to the election, they've proven that it's not just a polling fluke. They've been able to get the vote out. They've been able to convert that positivity into people turning out and putting a cross against their name on the ballot boxes. So whenever you get these kind of newer or more insurgent parties, I think sometimes there's a bit of a barrier where people are trying to question whether they really believe they can win. And this seems to me like a bit of a dam bursting moment that has occurred. And they'll be looking now towards the Senedd elections in Wales next year, the elections in Scotland, and then further in the future towards a general election to see if they can convert this in other areas as well.
And Christy, I think that a few weeks ago I was chatting to one Labour MP who referred, as Luke Trill from Moran commented, as the winter fuel payments potentially being the original sin of this Labour government, making that decision before the summer recess, before we had a long period before the budget and all those kind of budget wins was sort of publicised. That was really a factor, it seems, on the doorstep, and seems to be something that's cutting through ever across the country.
Yeah, I think that the strategy from Labour has been to get the bad stuff out of the way early on and hope that in 3.5 years' time, people feel the benefits in their pockets and ultimately reward Labour at the ballot box. Unfortunately, public opinion is incredibly fickle, and it's far easier to lose than it is to win back. And I think that strategy has backfired to some extent for the Labour Party. I don't think all is lost. I think that ultimately we still have a Conservative Party that are really struggling to get a grip with anything, and I don't think Kemi Badenoch has been able to mount any sort of recovery, but I don't think Labour would have banked on the insurgency that has been Reform UK. And I think that this set of local elections really ultimately provides a huge foundational block for Reform UK going forward. They haven't really had up until now any sort of real strong hardcore political representation, therefore a lack of credibility in the minds of voters. And I think that they don't have that anymore. And Holly's absolutely right to look at the Senedd next year and other local elections as real opportunities for reform that, in 3.5 years' time, when we do get to that general election, what will the country's councillors look like? How turquoise will the map end up looking?
And of course, it's 6 months today since Kemi Badenoch became leader. Happy anniversary, Kemi. Holly, what do the polls say about sort of Tory voters in terms of their willingness, perhaps, in a country now where it's so divided? Are they going to be sort of tactically voting for reform in certain areas of the country? How loyal is the kind of Tory core after these elections?
It's tricky to pick up tactical voting because it's not necessarily something that the voters will always admit to. And we see that in our polls following the general election. I think what it is important to say at this point for Kemi Badenoch herself is that her polling ratings haven't necessarily improved since the Conservatives lost that election in July. We're still seeing a high unfavourability rating in our Ipsos political pulse that we do on a monthly basis. And also, I think what's interesting is the issues that matter to voters. And voters ultimately want to see progress on the issues that matter to them. They differ slightly between the different political parties. We know that during the 2024 general election campaign, a lot of that Conservative support was lost on the basis of immigration and a perception that the Conservative government did not do well in dealing with that particular issue. So it will be interesting to see off the back of this how Kemi Badenoch frames her opposition, which policies she's willing to hang her hat on, and ultimately if Conservative 2024 voters or others are willing to get behind her on that, or in fact see other political parties as more appealing, based on what, for example, Reform choose to make their flagship policies as they move into actually being in control of some councils, for example, and moralities.
I mean, Chris, obviously it's not our job at The Spectator to act as sort of the thinking brain of CCHQ, but in terms of for the Conservatives to try and win over Reform, what should they be pinning their hopes for? I mean, from my understanding, the polling suggests that people do worry perhaps that Farage could be a bit divisive, or are they going to be a serious force? What are the kind of ways, if the pitfalls of Reform are watching this, they want to avoid in terms of keeping going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a slight difference between some sorts of Conservative voters that I think appeal to Reform UK more directly than others, and I think we saw that to some extent in Runcorn and Helsby, perhaps, where a lot of the Conservative voters in parts of that seat, the more affluent parts of that seat, probably do actually align themselves more with the Labour Party, perhaps, than Reform UK, and therefore these Conservative to Reform switches aren't all. You can't treat them as one sort of homogenous block and just assume that essentially the right of British politics is one sort of unique voting block. But obviously Reform UK have really parked their tanks on the Conservatives' lawn. Frankly, they did that at the 2024 general election, and Kemi Badenoch has not been able to win them back. I mean, I think it is an easier strategy for the Conservative Party to go after this sort of voter than it is for the Labour Party. Yeah. I think the Labour Party have an incredibly difficult needle to thread when it comes to how to deal with Reform UK, because they risk really alienating voters, their core vote on the left, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens. But I do think that the Conservative Party have that issue to some extent as well. But I think in terms of trying to make or mount some sort of recovery, I think at this point, Kemi Badenoch really does need to try and just rebuild the trust that the Conservatives have lost. And that's far harder, obviously, in opposition and without mass representation at local government level after the results that we're going to see in the coming hours than it would have been otherwise.
Well, good luck, Kemi. That was Chris Hopkins of Savanta and Holly Day from Ipsos. Do let us know what you're making of the results in the comments, and we'll be sure to discuss. Just a reminder too about the Spectator shop. We're open for business. You can shop a range of fantastic merch below, including this excellent Spectator Spring Gin, which I certainly have been drinking today. Joining me for the rest of the show shortly is going to be our economics editor, Michael Simmons. But before that, just a few reflections as well for myself about the kind of upcoming elections. We've obviously got the really key contest about happening with Hull. Four-way politics there properly going on between Lib Dems and Reform. They both really fancy their chances in that one. That's going to be a key thing to kind of tease ahead of next year's local elections, because at that we're going to see many more Lib-Lab contests in kind of those big northern constituencies. I think Newcastle's up for election, Sheffield too, Liverpool as well. So I think that's going to be one of the key sort of prototypes of the kind of forthcoming Lib-Lab battles we have. I wrote in The Spectator a couple of weeks ago that the Liberal Democrat HQ, the most effective anti-Tory killing machine in politics, has now started up its own anti-Labour unit. So perhaps the kind of loving we've often seen over the last few years between Sir Ed Davey and Sir Keir Starmer, the two knights of liberal Middle England, actually could turn into a bit of a sort of jousting match, as it were. So joining me now is my great colleague, Michael Simmons. Michael, how are you doing today?
I'm doing brilliantly, James. I'm very excited to be here. I've been enjoying the show.
Oh, God, well, that's one viewer at least. Now, you're going to take us through the finances of all this, because, of course, Reform have got in, as Graham was saying earlier, they've won 8 authorities. They've obviously won the Greater Lincolnshire Mayoralty. Tell us what's going to be in the in tray of those authorities that Reform are now winning.
Well, absolutely. If you look at this map, you've got what the councils, who controlled the councils until yesterday's votes. And if I seamlessly switch the map, we get the results now that have come in so far. And as you just mentioned, Nigel Farage on the broadcast round, I heard Gawain mention it, as you say, is pushing this idea of reform Doge. You know, they really want to cut spending, improve productivity at the local council.
Based on America, the Department of Government Efficiency.
Exactly, but also perhaps based on the Spectator's own Doge project, which we call SPAF, the Spectator's Project Against Frivolous Funding. And as part of that, we've been looking at some of the councils that Reform we thought were likely to win and have indeed won. So I have to apologise as a Scotsman, testing my English geography here slightly. But if I hover over what I think is Durham, you see the massive win for Reform there. But Durham's a council that's finances are really in trouble. They've got to balance the books. At the end of last year, they thought they had to raise about 20 million from cuts to services.
Yep.
But that's an underestimate. They now think it's closer to 25 million.
Wow.
So I think this is going to be the first real test of, reform in administration. They've talked the talk. What are they actually going to cut? Another council where it's a bit of a different picture, but they also win, is Lincolnshire, which I'm amazed I remembered where Lincolnshire is.
For a Scotsman, that's impressive.
Yes. Lincolnshire is an interesting one because Lincolnshire's sort of financial position has actually been described as remarkable. They're a rare council who's sort of in a bit of less trouble. That said, there are still staggering amounts of money that could quickly spiral, out of control. The OBR has warned particularly about funding for special educational needs. And this is where I think Nigel and Reform might come unstuck slightly, because it's very easy to say, oh, we should come to these councils, we can cut things. But as you know, James, a lot of the spending that's carried out by councils, they're forced to do that spending because of, statutes that come from central government. One particular example of that is taxes. So you see spending on, and this is to take people, with special needs, with different disabilities to schools, etc., etc.
Statutory requirements rather than local choices.
So, councils, you can't come into a council and, take this away. This is something that's mandated, but it's exploding because of, the rises of anxiety, of ADHD, different conditions that we write about in the Spectator all the time. So I don't think Reform are going to be able to deal with that at a local level, and it'll be interesting to see how they sort of explain that away when they come up against reality.
Yeah, we're a little pressed for time, Michael, so do you want to just go on to the next slide?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like Jonathan Van Tam. So if we change topic slightly, seamlessly happened here, going off the concept of SPAF, I think this is a really important point about benefit recipients and winter fuel payment. So this graph's slightly complicated, but just to explain it, what you're seeing here is, if you look at the top, you've got the Labour votes. This is in the by-election, the Labour votes in 2014.
General last year.
And that number is very similar to the winter fuel payments number for that area. So essentially, if what does seem to have happened today, which is people that are on PIP, people that have been recipients of the winter fuel payment, if they go to Reform in the numbers that they seem to be doing, at a national level, someone put it to me that to change their language slightly, Labour and the Tories are goosed. So I think this is if we look at the data, this is like the standout headline from the results
standout
today.
Headline. They're goosed. And I think what's really striking as well, Michael, of course, is the fact that, to use the Boris Johnson cakeist approach, pro having it, pro eating it, it seems the voters to danger are often sort of loving the spending but not wanting the cuts that come with that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And this is Reform, now has to exist in two places. Places where they don't need to make cuts, places where they do have to make cuts. How are they going to speak to both audiences?
Put their money where their mouth is. Well, Michael, you're going to be staying with us, and we're going to be straight back after this break with Tony Blair's former political secretary, John McTernan. Stay tuned.
If you enjoy Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? You can get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
Not everyone in this room is going to enjoy this next bit, which excites me enormously.
It's a very unique opportunity. I listen to Coffee House Shots podcast every single day. I love Kate Andrews.
Gentleman in the front row whose shoes and tie are far too nice to allow him to qualify as a working person under Keir Starmer's definition.
I think there's something engaging with listening to people you vehemently disagree with.
Do you think you're going to be able to win hearts and minds from the audience?
No, of course not, but it's going to be a great evening.
Nationalism versus globalization.
I think the government doesn't have any kind of plan.
Do you feel like you might want to come to more Spectator events in the future? Yeah, for sure.
Well, welcome back to the Spectator's local election live show. To help us wrap everything up, I'm also now joined by John McTernan, a long-time political advisor, former political secretary to Tony Blair. John, this has been a pretty bad night for Labour, hasn't it?
Been a complete disaster for the Labour Party, to be absolutely honest. Losing a safe seat in a by-election, it's bad enough. You could explain that because the MP was disgraced. But Labour are losing 3 of every 4 seats they're contesting in councils. and iconic councils like Durham County Council are going straight to reform. I think this is a huge step back for Labour. It's a huge statement by the voters that they're very unhappy and needs to be responded to quite directly.
And what's quite striking, John, is that, we were discussing earlier in the studio about sort of how Morgan McSweeney was really going after the sort of red wall vote, the kind of 2019 to 24 vote. And I've read a lot of your commentary on this. It seems that your concern is about sort of generals fighting the last war. You've constantly warned about Labour's forgetting its left wing, its left coalition unwinding. And you're saying actually embrace the fact you're progressive, embrace the green agenda, and also your agenda on trade unions as well.
Well, I think two things to say on that. Look, Labour lost a by-election in London, in Lambeth, in Herne Hill, to the Greens last night. That being eaten on the other side, that's happening. But also, there's something strong and powerful and actually quite attractive about Labour's policies. That's why Nigel Farage himself is doing a bit of cross-dressing. He's taking on Labour policy. He's for nationalisation. He's for the workers. So in that case, we should be the real thing. We should be the real proper soft left progressive party. Things like Great British Energy, very patriotic, very popular. Nationalising the railways, very popular. Renters' rights, very popular. And I think the big obstacle for us is that the strategy pursued by the government at the moment has got an emblem, a big emblem to it, and that is cutting winter fuel payments. And that makes Labour seem not Labour, because we're not about cutting back the welfare state. We're about expanding the welfare state. And that is also seen as cruel. And that sense of cruelty, why is Labour being cruel to pensioners, is now being extended. It was on the doorsteps in Runcorn. I know it's been on the doorsteps in Doncaster. Why are we cutting disability benefits? The areas where there are most people on PIP tend to be areas which are red wall, which are targets for reform, not just targets anymore. They're actually areas that reform now represent. So there's something about Labour has got to get off thinking that cutting benefits is attractive to red wall voters. It isn't. And it's also not Labour, and it's also deeply unpopular.
And it sounds there then, you would be sort of against a sort of post-election reshuffle. There seems to be a lot of talk about this in Westminster right now. Some of the names potentially in the frame would be one of them, sort of Ed Miliband. Some people really don't like him. He seems a bit of a Marmite character in Labour. Some love him, some less so much. Lisa Nandy could be one of the ones. What do you think about sort of an election reshuffle?
Utterly insane to have a post-election reshuffle. It would show panic. Because, let's go back, the policies, and Luke Trill at More in Common has tested loads of the Labour Party policies, and there's ones which have high cut-through, cutting winter fuel payments, high cut-through, highly unpopular. And ones which, when you're told about people, the voters like them, they love the new rights for workers. They love a whole bunch of these soft left policies, but you never hear Angela Rayner talking about them. They actually love energy security. It's patriotic. They love the idea of Great British Energy, a nationalised company in which the profits from the energy transition come back to British ownership. There's all these policies. We don't talk about them as a government, partly because the soft left characters aren't put on the grid, the government strategic communications grid. They don't get out there to respond to a rebuke from the voters, which is saying you're not left-wing enough, by going, do you know what we're going to do if we're told by the voters we're not left-wing enough? We're going to sack all the soft left ministers. It would be genuinely, utterly insane.
Well, we've got now Michael Simmons, my colleague, for some of the readers' comments. So what are the readers all saying? And the listeners and viewers, I should say, actually. I'm thinking very analogue in a digital age. What are they saying?
We're too print-framed. So at the risk of creating some sort of infinite feedback loop, I've been looking at the comments while you were talking just there. So to the person who called my slideshow unreadable, consider your subscription cancelled.
Probably Fraser Nelson.
Yes. There's quite a few comments that are coming through that are sort of saying, this is reform's kind of first test of having to work with unelected officials. Some might describe that as the blob. And James, I wonder what you think. Our readers say, how are reform going to progress if the blob does try to stop them or hamper their agenda?
I think a key point will be best practice, really. And I think that reform throughout this local elections, obviously campaigning is very, very different from governing. One of the things they've done is run it all out of HQ in quite a slick, professional way. The key thing will be getting in touch with those sort of national level, unlike, I think, a lot of traditional two parties, etc., where they're very different political complexions, different cultures. Sometimes that can be really good and you can have sort of let a thousand flowers bloom. But other times you get some really bad councils part of the country. And I don't think that's a sort of partisan point. It's both Labour and Conservatives. Now we see what reform will have. If they're sort of working well, they'll be able to share best practice on things like HR and some new people, new broom, and that would be great. I think the key thing, of course, is sort of learning the lessons from each other and working with some of the think tanks. I'm really interested to see how this Revolution 1850, I think it's called, the new sort of reform think tank or reform linked think tank is going to do. So I think learning different policies and seeing what works.
And just if we've got time for another reader question, a few readers are making the point that there is obviously, as you've said earlier on, this is a terrible day for Kemi. But if a few of the readers have pointed out that it's not, they say it's not about Kemi, it's about 14 years of Tory rule where, as they say it, nothing happened or we arguably went backwards. If that is the case, can the Tories pull anything back at all?
I want to get John on this in a second, but I'll just answer it quickly. Clearly, it's not Kemi's fault what happened for the past 14 years. Equally, she put herself forward for the leadership. She chose to stand, others didn't. And she now has to be the one who deals with it. And all they can do is change the current leader. And I think there are some criticisms of her which are invalid and some which are valid. I think there's points about the speed with which the Conservatives respond. I think if you're not first, if you're last. And I think Reform often just have the best tunes and reply quicker to sort of stuff and get things out there. And I think that would be really important. I do wonder, we were talking earlier with sort of Tim Shipman talking about unity. There's unity of the grave. Sometimes picking a few fights might be a good thing. She likes a fight for Kemi Badenoch, certainly. So I think that the key thing will be sort of recovering. But, I mean, they really need to rebrand. I think that very few voters, even very few Conservatives, have much good to say about the past 14 years. She ought to rebrand as the new Conservative. She ought to show she's different, a bit like Keir Starmer did, kicking out Jeremy Corbyn, lots of change. And I think that the Tories ought to learn more from Keir Starmer than disparage him about his time in opposition. John?
No, look, I think that's right. I think in opposition, you have to study and really understand why you lost and then address that. And I don't get the feeling yet that the Tories have had an internal debate that goes, we lost because of this. Look, they've been unlucky. Normally an opposition comes into power with a big landslide like Labour did. They get a honeymoon. In the honeymoon, the defeated party are able to lick their wounds and think again. There's been no honeymoon for Labour. We can see that, can't we, in the results? But it means there's been no cover for the Tories doing their rethinking. But there is an element of poor tactics. I think one thing that Keir Starmer in opposition was very, very acutely tactical. Why is it that Kemi Badenoch hasn't exploited the government's discomfort around agriculture and farms, about taxes on small farms, and all of those areas which are instinctively conservative, but let reform occupy that space? I can see why Kemi Badenoch wouldn't want to support nationalising the steel industry. She can't be as opportunistic as Farage. But there's fights which the Tories should be leading, but you don't feel that the Tories even feel that there's an emblematic, a symbolic, an emotional issue that they should get. And that when the party is so beaten down, as it is a small parliamentary party, when it doesn't seem to reflect the feelings of the country, that's a dangerous detachment. But I don't think that constantly changing leaders is going to help, because unless you've got an analysis on what went wrong, you can't address it. And unless you've decided fundamentally whether you want to bury reform or marry them, you'll never make any progress. And if the Tories believe that they should marry reform in some kind of way, they will eventually be eaten. You cannot do compromises with parties who are your opponents on the same side of politics as you. You have to beat them. Now, you might lose an electoral cycle by fighting them, but you will never ever survive if you decide, you'll have to make a deal with these people. Nigel Farage has shown how ruthless he is, and he'll be ruthless enough to say every deal we do will be from reform's end of the market. Reform will argue with strength about those. So I think changing the leader won't work without a strategy, and a strategy has to be, how do you protect the Conservative brand in the short, medium and long term? And that is a really big question. That does require some thinking.
And I mean, I think that Nigel Farage has really based his party off the Canadian Reform Party, which started in the late 1980s. And of course, what happened after a number of sort of election defeats for the right of politics there, it ended up swallowing up the traditional progressive Conservative Party. And they've just lost with a former reformer, Pierre Poilievre, in Canada, that big election. Michael, do you have a few more comments?
Yeah, so just on the reader or the viewer feedback, somebody thinks we're all mad. And so it's good to finally feel seen. But on some...
I probably am, but what's the reason why?
I think that's something we can discuss once we're off air, James. But the last sort of three comments that I think sort of sum it up. One from Nigel Smith says, he always voted Conservative thinking they were a right-wing party. He'll never trust them again. Let's give Reform a chance. Peter Docherty thinks that we're going to see more Tory defections as they take this as the writing on the wall. And finally, Sharon says it seems that if you are a right-wing voter or centre-right voter, reform is your only electoral chance. That seems to be the mood that voters and our viewers are taking from this election.
Okay, we'll go to John in a sec. Just for me, first of all, I think that, you're right. I think everyone says, what do the Conservatives stand for? Traditionally, you'd think a couple of things. Low taxes, tough on crime, tough on borders. And what happened? Some of those things were outside their control, but we saw the pandemic, huge increase in government spending, taxes went up, biggest post-war tax burden since the 1940s. You saw crime really sort of change in terms of the nature of what was happening post-pandemic as well. And you saw record migration, huge, almost 1 million people net coming in. And so I think for all that, people say, look, you're laughing in our face. And of course, that goes on to the second point about sort of choice, etc. in politics. My slight frustration with some of the people around Karen Baynock, and not necessarily her in fairness, but some of her supporters are saying, well, look at Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher was the age of 3 TV channels. We are now in the age of 24/7, multiple media channels. There is much more choice in the market. If you don't like the Conservatives or Labour, you can now go to Reform, to Independents, to the Liberal Democrats, and they will be able to sort of choose your different complexions. Much more a la carte menu than traditional, than a set club menu. And then the third point was, what was it about?
The third point was, are they the only serious electable force if you are of a centre-right disposition?
I think it all depends. We need to see the shakeout of the results, etc. I don't think so, but that's the danger, is that voters, and suddenly first past the post has traditionally been an impediment to Nigel Farage's parties, and now it starts becoming a headwind and actually starts benefiting them. And that is the real kicker about first past the post. Once it's benefiting you, you never want to change the system. John?
Look, I think on the Margaret Thatcher point, you made a very good point there. Not just 3 TV channels, though. Those were TV channels that closed down at 11:30 and 11:45 at night. It's a very different environment that we were in. I remember talking to a former advisor to Tony Crosland, and when Tony Crosland was in government in the 70s, they were pleased if they got one Today programme interview a month. That was really top coverage. Totally different pace of everything. So there's that. Look, and I think the problem that the Tories have to confront is, I do think that the Boris wave, the 800,000, 900,000, 1 million migrants who came in during the last Tory government, during the Boris period, that's probably changed the nature of politics. It may have changed the nature of the UK, but it changes the Tory party's position, because anybody can say, but you're not serious about it. Labour could say it from an efficiency point of view. Farage can say it from a numbers point of view. But until the Tories work out what they're going to say about that, how will they possibly be a viable or a credible opposition? And look, I think the point on first past the post is it's a magnifier. It's a magnifier of defeat. It's a magnifier of victory. If we're in 4-party politics, 26% of the vote gets you a constituency. If we're in 5-party politics, which we are in many areas, because there's the Greens and the Lib Dems and Labour and the Tories and Reform. Maybe 6-party, you include the Nationalists or you include the Independents in urban areas. You're looking at having a very small margin needed to win a seat. 21% if gets you a seat if 5 people are equally balanced. Those kinds of things mean what we saw in the last 2 elections. 2019, Labour got 34% of the vote and got gubbed. There's a Tory landslide. In 2024, Labour got 34% of the vote, and Labour got a landslide victory. Small changes in distribution of vote have huge impact when you have multi-party politics. Politics has definitely fragmented. I think it's gone now. The 2-party, the duopoly, the control that there was there, and in the 50s, 94% of people voted one of the 2 main parties. That has really gone. I suspect that over the weekend, as we see the results coming out, this will be a great result for the Lib Dems, as well as a great result for Reform, really putting it strongly in the place. I was thinking, well, do you know what? This is really 4-party politics across England.
Yes.
4-party. And we know from the opinion polling, Reform are going to do strongly in the Senate in Wales next year and in Scotland in the Parliament. So there's multi-party politics, fragmentation, and in first past the post, with these small margins, Reform could do really well, or not quite so well, because the thing I'll finish on, Labour's machine for getting out the vote is ruthlessly brilliant. I mean, they almost withheld Reform in Runcorn, 6 votes. It was, 6 votes the other way, the swing would have been as bad, but the optics have been very, very different. Look at the west of England, where Labour held off, and look at North Tyneside, look at Doncaster, areas where it could be much, much worse looking for Labour because their machine can get people out. And in an election where you have 4 or 5 parties contending, then organisation on the ground really matters. Reform have got a brilliant online organisation. Have they got a field operation that can be used? I think the Tories have got neither a good field operation nor an online operation, and they've got this huge question that sits over them. What are they for, and who are they for?
Well, thank you, John. And that's all we've got time for. But of course, who are you for? And if you're for lively discussion and certainly good gin, I would recommend that you subscribe to the Spectator magazine as well. So we've got a good offer going on, 12 weeks for just £12 at spectator.co.uk/TV offer. Keep the conversation going on in the comments. And that's all for today. Until next time, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV today.